Welcome, guys, to the Touchdown Podcast. Today, a very special episode. I'm joined by our resident SEC expert. That's George Somerville.
Kieran, hi. Nice to meet you in person. It's got to that time of year now, isn't it? It's the squeaky bum time, as they say, and we're going to talk about some of our favourite players, I guess.
Yeah, it's that time of year where people are starting to look at the Heisman. There's obviously a million different opinions flying around. We're seeing guys like JJ McCarthy fall out of the race, Marvin Harrison kind of being a little bit questioned if he deserves to be in the race. But I think the top three guys we've got in both of our races would all be good contenders for the most outstanding player in college award. But without further ado, let's start with our number three, because I'm pretty sure we have the same number three. So who have you got on number three, George?
Well, the guy who led the charge for most of the season, frankly, he was the close to being preseason favourite, I think. I never thought Caleb Williams was going to repeat it, and I don't say that after the fact. I think it's an incredibly hard thing to do. I think the young man has shown the pressure that got to his shoulders. Sorry, the pressure that was on his shoulders, I think it got to him. So for me, number three just now, and we'll definitely get an invite to New York, is Michael Penix Jr. at Washington. Washington have had a fantastic season. He's had a fantastic season. In many ways, he deserves to be the Heisman. People listening to this will be screaming at us that he should be the Heisman winner, but I think there's a couple of other players perhaps that might just pip him to the post.
Yeah, Penix has had a fantastic season, and it's kind of rare. I don't want to like dog on left-handed quarterbacks, but it's not the most common thing to see, and to then see one elevate his game to the level he's elevated it, coming from, Indiana. He was always talked about as a guy who was phenomenal athlete, but laying his body on the line far too much. And I think that was really affecting him. But since he's been in Washington, he's been absolutely phenomenal. He's probably going to hit 4,000 passing yards on the season. He's probably going to hit 35 TDs, and with only 7 interceptions, ball security is pretty good from this guy. The left-handed thing, I think people need to take that out of the equation. Just look at the quarterback as the quarterback, and obviously he's surrounded by talent. But why do we have him at number three? Is this a leap you expected him to make after last year?
No, I didn't. And listen, I'm sitting here with my SEC jersey on, so I'm not even going to pretend. Although we do talk about the Pac-12 a lot on the college chaps. Well, as you rightly say, he's a transfer. Why at three? Well, actually, I'm going to go the sort of the opposite way insofar as you've just touched upon this a little bit. He's got so much talent round about him, and I guess when I'm looking at Heisman, clearly not a voter, never will be a voter either, but it's an outstanding player. Many ways, I think people always try to define what the Heisman is, right? And in many ways, a lot of that definition that comes out is about the player who stands out, the player who carries the team on his shoulders, the player who drives results. And I find it difficult because when we're not going to, well, I don't think we're going to talk about Travis Hunter, but there's a player who I think has driven a team forward on his shoulders, right? And I think Penix is maybe going to lose out on the back of the fact that he's an exceptional player within a bunch of an exceptional team. Didn't say that very articulately. I think that might be where he loses votes. But for me, he definitely should get an invite. And if enough voters go his way, then he could well be picking it up, which, as we know, is unusual for the Pac-12. And again, I think not to prolong this argument, I think the Pac-12 has been such a fantastic competition this year that you don't get the same old, we're not going to wait up till midnight or whatever time to watch the game. So he's not had the Christian McCaffrey effect. He's probably been able to get his performances out there, and people get really interested in him.
Yeah, and it's good that you touch on the team around him, because I think one thing people are actually forgetting about all three quarterbacks is, they are surrounded by massive amounts of talent. And the big thing I think at UW is actually that offensive line. Penix has only been sacked 7 times all year, which is absolutely incredible, especially for a guy who moves the way he does. He scrambles out of the pocket a lot, and he tries to extend plays. And sometimes we've seen with, Joe Burrow, for example, that can kind of lead to dudes taking unnecessary sacks. And just give a shout out to Troy Fautanu, I think is how you pronounce it. Number 55 on the Huskies offensive line. He has been an absolute monster all season. And that line, he's also got a great stable of receivers there. I think that's the big thing that's being talked about in this is all three quarterbacks, all transfers, and all have fantastic receiving cores, pretty good offensive lines. So when you take that into account, I think, every guy is sort of on level pegging in that regard. But yeah, Penix is a guy I think a lot of people had pegged preseason. And I think maybe the two guys we're going to talk about next weren't necessarily in contention in the preseason. I know the guy who we've probably both got at number 1 definitely wasn't in contention before this season. And the man we're actually going to talk about next, there was buzz, but it wasn't to where it was now. So my number 2, I think also your number 2, it's got to be Bo Nix, another transfer. He went from the SEC, he was an Auburn Tiger, now he's an Oregon Duck. Before we get into talking about how good he's been this season, did you like this move for him?
Well, he needs to get out of Auburn, right? And it was a really good piece. I think it was on game day at the weekend about the move. I think Marty Smith went to speak to him, and he clearly needed to get out. The pressure on his shoulders with his dad being, something about. In fact, the whole family, going to Auburn. He always Bo always wanted to play at Auburn. For those who are listening who are familiar with the SEC and Auburn, they realise what a difficult place that is to go and play football. There's a lot of competing politics that go on there. I remember I remember being down in that neck of the woods, and the chat then was that it was really the boosters who were trying to put Bo Nix in as the QB1 at that point. The coaching staff didn't really quite buy into him, and you wonder how much of an impact that had in his Auburn career. Now, he had some fantastic games as an Auburn Tiger. Nothing like the season he's had up in Eugene. Nothing at all. So I think I liked the move insofar as it got him probably geographically as far away from Auburn as he could have got, right?
It's the exact opposite end of the country.
You draw a straight arrow, your next stop is Russia, I think. I thought from that perspective, listen, it was an eyebrow raiser. I wasn't entirely sure he was going to transfer away because his ties were so close to being in Auburn. It was a very bold move, particularly given Dan Lanning had hardly got his feet under the desk there. So I guess everybody had a bit of a roll of the dice with that move, and it certainly paid off.
Yeah. Now, something to speak for the level of defenses in the Pac-12. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but the level he's playing at, I mean, it's him and Penix basically running that entire conference, and I don't think you can even blame it on his defense or other defenses he's playing when he's going to have to put up an immense amount of points every single game. He's played phenomenally so far. I don't know if he's going to quite hit 4,000 yards, but he definitely could with one more solid game. We've seen him have these kind of monster games. He'll probably hit 40 touchdowns again. And he's only had 2 picks, which is the least out of the guys we're talking about. So ball security has been absolutely fantastic. Also, another stable of great receivers, a fairly solid offensive line, a good team around him. When we looked at the Bo Nix or Auburn, did you ever foresee him having this sort of? Did you ever see him being talked about in playoff Heisman contention? Because I know preseason, there was a lot of, mock drafts where he was going in the first round. And I thought that was a bit of a reach to start with, but he's really pulled that out. Do you think it's the change of scheme and the scenery that's given him this rise, or do you think it's just, getting that monkey off his back, being the pressure that it is playing in an Alabama school?
I suspect it's a combination of all of those, Kieran, to be honest. I think the pressure was massive, and he's admitted that himself. And, Auburn's been a difficult place to play. You look at what's happened there over the last 3 or 4 years. The coaching hire of Brian Harsin was a complete and utter disaster. And, as much as my allegiances might be in Tuscaloosa, no pleasure in saying that was a disaster. And so he had to play during a time when, and again, we've touched a little bit on the offensive lines that these guys are playing behind. Didn't have anything great. Auburn were just in free fall, to be perfectly honest. So he's moved to Oregon. I just get a sense that there's a real air of positivity around that program. You've got a new coach, a young coach, a well thought of coach, someone who's really, put his heart and soul into it. You've got the talent at Oregon, because by Jove, they've got a ton of talent there, and traditionally have, right?
They're stacked. Yeah. It's one of those schools as well. They're going to have NFL talent at least 2 or 3 positions, and to have that in the positions this year that helps Bo is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've got a combination of all of that, and maybe all the parts have come together, right? Maybe he's just, but good on him, because a lot of people thought very highly of him in the SEC. I never really saw the potential that others were talking about, but I'm so glad that he's moved to a school where we finally get to see the quarterback that people thought he was, and I think he's had a fantastic season.
Yeah, I was going to say, there was a lot more expected of him at Auburn. And I know part of that is the SEC. I know part of that's being a football player in Alabama, and part of that's the heritage of that school. Like I said, you're a Bama fan, so you kind of know there is that storied rivalry. Despite the fact you guys coming out on top, there is still a lot of pressure every year having to play teams like Alabama, LSU, and things like that. And I think Oregon, they went really hard in promoting him as well. We saw all the preseason, the Bo Knows stuff. There was so much stuff going on, so much stock put into him. And I think while there was obviously a big pressure in the SEC, I actually feel like as he matured and grew, he had pressure at Oregon, but I think it just felt a little bit more comfortable to him because he knew he had the guys around him.
Yeah. And I think you touched on this a little bit. I didn't think he was necessarily a Heisman candidate at the start of the season. And in fact, obviously Oregon lost out to Washington early on in the season. So I think actually he got bumped back. So that shows you 2 things. One, how well Oregon's done this year and Bo Nix has done here to overcome that. And also the way that the voting goes, right? Your Heisman favourite in the first couple of weeks is, unless they're stellar, is never going to be the guy at the end of it. So I think it just shows you how well they've done. And just, I will say this, it's Iron Bowl this weekend, right? Alabama would not want to be going up against this version of Bo Nix. They would not, right? So I think that shows you how much he's come on, and this season he's done great.
Yeah, he'd be a real difference maker, and I think we're probably going to touch on that in a minute. How different this guy not being in the game can affect a game. We obviously saw, like I said, next Heisman candidate, his game against Alabama. We saw the tone shift of the game when he was taken out of the game by. We won't debate the hit, but he was taken out of the game. We really saw it change. So I think that is a big plus for Bo Nix, is that Auburn potentially could have had a very different season if he was still there and if there was some of the talent around him. But I think if we look at it, he's probably the only guy who was on this list preseason who's managed to stay there, which meant he's met the expectations put on him by the media, which is not always an easy thing to do, especially as a transfer. But let's talk about both of our number ones, the guy who I think should win the Heisman and the guy who, if he doesn't win the Heisman, I will not shut up about it for probably the next decade. Um, it. Do you want to introduce him, or should I do it?
Oh well, let me, because I suspect you're going to talk, you're going to wax lyrically for the next however long.
Oh,
Jaden Daniels, I think, should be the Heisman winner. That will not go down well in many places, but to me, he's recently joined a fairly elite list of players who have thrown for 3,000 yards and rushed for 1,000 yards in one season. So and Brian Kelly, as you've seen from my tweets, Brian Kelly has been pushing hard that Jaden Daniels should be one in New York and actually should be holding that trophy at the end of the evening.
yeah, it's a confusing one because last year we had what I would call a fairly good defense, but we had absolutely no offense. Jaden was a run first guy. He just didn't have what it seemed like he didn't have the arm strength. He wasn't putting the velocity on the ball. Now he was making safe throws, but he was also the second an edge rusher even got an arm free. He was taken off, and that obviously led to an injury. Tough, but after a solid off season, he's finally put on some weight because reports from last season that he was 170-ish pounds. I'm 175 and I'm 5'9". He's 6'4". That's not the best build for a guy to be taking hits, especially if he's looking at NFL prospects. But he's fixed a lot of his game. He put on some weight. He's been in the weight room. He's fixed his passing to an extent. He looks like a lot better passer. If you compare passes from now and last year, the difference is absolutely night and day. Jaden has played the toughest schedule in America, which I didn't believe until I actually looked at it. I thought the defense was just making it look like the hardest schedule in America, because there's no world where you should be having to score 50 points to win a game. I'm sure Lee can relate, being a Chargers fan. He leads the country in total yards by more than 800 yards. He's got almost 1,000 more than Penix and Nix. He leads the FBS in total touchdown, yards per carry, and holds the highest passer rating in FBS history. LSU has played. Sorry, there's another one. I've got a heap of notes about this. A lot of people have thrown stat padding out there, even though Bo Nix has been playing fourth quarter against FCS teams and things like that. LSU has 70 plays of 20 plus yards. The closest to that is USC with 59. He's going absolutely huge. On the season currently, let me pull up that because it's in a separate window. 3,500 yards, 36 touchdowns, 4 picks, leads college football in QBR as well, but QBR is a funny stat. I think it can be leaned on, it can be disregarded. So I'm not
certainly in college, no doubt, right?
It's one of those things we talk about. As good as anyone, we don't use stats for illumination. We use them for stability. It's the same way a drunk man uses a lamppost. It's not. They're always there to help support your argument, but never form it. So I'm just bringing up these things for a little bit of context. He's also led his team to touchdown drives on his last 13 drives. He scored on all 13 of them. He's fantastic on the ground. He's fantastic through the air. He's brought Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, both guys into the Bolitnikov semifinals, which is absolutely incredible, from guys who were kind of lucky to catch 100 yards from him a game last year, guys who I kind of was worried that they'd fallen off a little bit. It's just sad that Matt House is our defensive coordinator, because he shouldn't be having to put up these stats every single game to win games. And I think this is actually going to hurt him. How do you feel like these? Because obviously I've spoken to Jack about like Lamar Jackson, 3 losses, RG3, 3 losses. We got a lot of Heisman winners with multiple losses, and we're obviously playing A&M this weekend. How do you think the losses affect the narrative against Jaden Daniels?
Well, I mean, people will always try to find excuses not to vote for somebody, right? I do think that the voters go into this and probably have their favourites, and will look at reasons as to why Jayden Daniels shouldn't win it. So about three or 4 weeks ago, I joined the SEC head coaches conference call each week, and I think it was 3 weeks ago, and Brian Kelly opened it up with a series of stats. And he said at that point that Jayden Daniels was the best quarterback in America, and Jayden Daniels was the best quarterback that LSU has had in its history, and he was better than Joe Burrow, right? So that raised immediate eyebrows as to, okay, but that's a big statement. But actually, when you go back and listen, one of my proudest moments watching college football was being in Bryant-Denny in 2019 when Alabama played LSU. Perhaps two of the best teams that we've ever seen in college football. We know that 2019 LSU Tigers is the best team to play in college football. So to say that Jayden Daniels is not only just on a par, but better than, and obviously, last weekend he broke Joe Burrow's, he broke the SEC record, he broke Joe Burrow's record. It tells you that he's playing on a different stratosphere. That's what I think voters should be looking at, not the losses that they've got on their record, because the losses are down to what's been an eye-watering defense for LSU this year. And if LSU had managed to sort out their defense, they'd be playing for ACC championship, and they would be in with a shout of playing for a national championship.
I believe if we had an average defense, we'd be undefeated. I truly believe that. I also think if you might disagree with this, given the way the game has gone, but I also think if Jayden Daniels hadn't got hurt against Alabama, that game potentially would have been a different outcome. And that's not to disparage Alabama in any way, shape, or form. They're a phenomenal team. I just think they're not at the talent level that they are normally at. And I feel like we had the opportunity to take advantage of that, but obviously things went a different way. And I obviously, the calls could have gone either way, but I obviously don't have any ill will towards the Alabama team for that. They're just playing football, that they don't control what the refs do. But obviously they've gone up against big opponents and, blown out Auburn, absolutely destroyed Florida, decimated Army. They've just absolutely destroyed everyone. And everyone destroyed everyone they've beat. Because we have got 3 losses on the year, Alabama being an absolutely huge one. You know better than anyone. That game is charged every single year. But I think you've got into... Me personally, I don't take the wins and losses into account because I think that's counterproductive. I don't think wins have ever been a QB stat. It's tough because all 3 players are absolutely quality. Jayden Daniels, I believe, is the best, but we've got to look at where they're going. And Bo Nix and Michael Penix both have a far more upward trajectory towards the end of the season. They're both going to be in better contention for New Year's Six Bowls, playoffs, that sort of thing. Do you think a team's losses should affect a quarterback or any player's race in the Heisman? Or do you think it just does that naturally?
Well, I mean, I think it doesn't naturally. I think we get into this quasi college football playoff mindset. We get into quality of schedule, we get into quality of loss, all of that kind of stuff. As I said, I'm not a voter, but I think it should be the impact and the play that it's the best player in college football traditionally. I mean, that doesn't need to be a quarterback, but we could debate that all night, all year, frankly. I look back, as I said before, I look back to the players who have had the biggest impact. I misquoted earlier on. I called him Travis Hunter. I wasn't thinking about the Colorado cornerback. I was thinking Jordan Travis, right? Now, he's injured now. His season is over, which is such a shame, right? But there's a player who has, and I'm not, I think Florida State are a really good team, but he has made the difference. When Florida State have had some ugly wins, and it's been as a result of Jordan Travis. So there you go. In terms of most valuable player, there's a guy who's, in terms of that team, he's had the biggest impact. I think I think you're right in terms of coming. It's not how you start; it's how you end. Bo Nick's been a really good example of that. Jordan Travis is injured; he's not going to get to play against Florida. I think he's out running anyway. So I think what's going to happen now over the course of this weekend, because after that, that's the regular season finished, and I think Heisman voting finishes on December the 4th. I think. Then you've got Bo Nix plays Oregon State. Michael Penix Jr.'s got Washington State, and LSU's got Texas A&M. And then, so it's who I wouldn't say necessarily it's all up for grabs, but I think it's if someone wants to make a statement and someone wants to make another Heisman moment, this is the weekend to do it. And although you can argue that all of these guys have had Heisman moments. I mean, we've got to a ridiculous stage where, Jaden Daniels is throwing and Bo Nix are throwing 6 touchdowns in a game, kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's the stats are quite phenomenal. So to answer your question, it shouldn't. It probably does, but that's life.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think even unconscious bias is going to come into this as much as in your brain you're thinking, I'm being objective, I'm weighing all the pros, the cons. It's just bias is going to come into it one way or another. There's going to be somebody who in the back of their mind doesn't like either free guy for any reason and is going to give the vote another way for one reason or another. I just did find it interesting that all 3 quarterbacks are transfers.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say about the impact these guys have had, because obviously we see Bo Nix and Penix get benched late in games, bring the backups on. But I think the biggest disparity in talent is when you see Jaden Daniels backup Garrett Nussmeier come on. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm a big Garrett Nussmeier fan. Always have been. I was screaming Nuss Bus all last season. That was what I was on. He's a highly touted recruit. His dad is an NFL quarterbacks coach. He's got a rocket arm, but you can really see the difference in experience when these two play. Jaden Daniels, very, very smart, makes very smart reads, very smart throws, keeps... Garrett Nussmeier just lets that shit rip. And we saw it in the Alabama game. He kind of just got taken to task. And I'm not sure if we're seeing that level from the Penix and Nix's backups. They're not really getting torn apart as much. So I think, like you said, that elevation of talent and the elevation of the roster around him, now Jordan Travis isn't in the running. I think you've got to give the edge to Daniels there as well. Especially in the SEC. I hate to be a homer on this. I hate to be the guy who's like, it just means more. But you know better than anyone, the SEC is the toughest division to play football in. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's why it's so incredible that Jaden has been putting up the numbers he does. Because the offense is constantly gassed. They are very, very tired. They get almost no support from the defense. Look, even against Georgia State, we still let them score on their first 2 drives of the game, which should not be happening. Matt House will come out and blame the personnel. The personnel come out and blame Matt House. But that's something that he doesn't have that the other 2 does, is a defense. And I think when we talk, like you said, about that elevation of the roster around him, I think that really needs to be taken into consideration.
I think it does. I do think to a degree the unconscious bias does come into the voting for the SEC. To be perfectly honest, I think I think that's probably why Caleb Williams was never going to, even if he did a good season, I don't think he was ever going to get re-invited back to New York. But I think people will be looking for. We saw at the start of the season with Colorado, everyone had crowned Colorado kings of college football. People just want to see something different. It's why we're not talking about Carson Beck as a Heisman runner, right? When you look back at the end of the season, I've got no doubt Georgia three-peats here. You'll realise that, and for all the talk of Stetson Bennett, right, and let's not go over old ground, but the Georgia fans didn't like him, didn't want him, he wasn't the guy for him. Carson Beck came in. Stetson's great. Stetson's the king. All of that kind of stuff. He's quietly gone about his work this year and proven to be a really good player. But has he hit the heights of dragging that Georgia team forward? Well, no, because he's surrounded by such incredible talent that he's not the standout. So you need to be on a team that gets you that kind of national focus. And all of the three guys that we talked about have had that national focus. Now, I personally think that Bo Nix might put Jayden Daniels to this. And I think he's, bizarrely, for someone playing the Pac-12, I think he's probably got the better exposure because he's played in some of the bigger games. Now,
also, Oregon are a lot bigger name than UW. I know, obviously, UW are a very good team, but when it comes to like those blue blood teams, when you think of big teams, Oregon's always one that's going to pop up, regardless of how they're playing that year.
Yeah, and they've had a great season, and they're on everybody's lips, and people are watching them. People want to watch them. People want to turn on the TV to see them. They're on the periphery of a college football playoff place. So and could well end up there. So I've got a feeling perhaps that it'll be interesting. You never know with a Heisman, to be perfectly honest, who's going to get it. But I've got a feeling maybe Nix might pip the post for that one.
So we've both got Jayden as who we think should win. But who do you think will actually win? Because I know, obviously, especially if LSU lose this weekend, which I don't think they will, but I think if we somehow fall to the team that still hangs banners from 1923, I think he's probably out of the race if they lose to A&M. I think that's fair to say. As much as it wouldn't be his fault because he'll probably still throw for like 10 touchdowns or something ridiculous, but the defense being as leaky as it is, I can imagine it will still probably have to go to like quadruple overtime or something ridiculous. So obviously we think Jayden should be the winner, but who do you think will win it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think LSU will fall to Texas A&M because I think Texas A&M are something of a let's call them transitional team at this moment in time, right, and be kind about it. So I think, Oregon beats Oregon State. Bo Nix puts up a show. Oregon ends up in the Pac-12. Can they get? I'm sorry, I was reading this before I came on, but Oregon can still get into the Pac-12 playoff, can't they? So Oregon gets into the Pac-12 playoff. That means they'd play up against Washington again. I hope I've not got that horribly wrong. I think that gets them back on the front pages, the back pages, depending what newspaper you read. So I think a big game against Oregon State gets them in Heisman voters' minds at the right time. Jayden Daniels could throw 7 touchdowns against Texas A&M, and it doesn't really mean much. And I, as much as I'm contradicting what I've said for the previous 30 minutes, I do think that if Oregon gets a result out of this and Bo Nix has really impressed or driven them to it, then I think he's going to win it. But then it's probably going to be Michael Penix Jr. But hey, I think it might be Nix.
Yeah, I think especially if, not even if Jayden has a stinker, but doesn't look as good as he has all season. I think it really is going to come down to this game for all three guys in a sense, because last game of the season for a lot of these guys, people don't know where rankings are going to fall after this. And also we don't know how the games are going to go. Guys have bad games, and Jayden had, I'd probably say, 2 bad games this season so far. I think Penix and Bo Nix have each had a kind of bad game apiece too. But I think especially if this weekend doesn't go to plan for LSU, I think probably we can nail on Bo Nix as the winner, even if we think he deserves it or not.
Yeah, Oregon are going to, they're always playing Oregon State, but they're going up against Arizona. If Arizona beat Arizona State, then I think Arizona get into the Pac-12 championship game against Washington. Are already there. So there's your dilemma if you're Kalen DeBoer obviously he wants to win the Apple Cup, but they're already in the Pac-12 championship game. So how much do you risk Penix Jr. in that game, particularly if Washington was to get a good start on them? That then plays into Bo Nix's hands if he gets a good game against the Beavers. Arizona doesn't get a result against Arizona State. Oregon end up in the Pac-12 championship game, and Bo Nix had a blazing game. I think then that Jaden Daniels falls into the background a little bit because 6 touchdowns against Texas A&M actually means not very much.
Yeah, it's a struggle. And I do have one final question that I didn't tell you beforehand because I just want like maybe in another just pure from the brain reaction without having to think about it too much. Who is a dark horse you would have added to this Heisman list this year? Maybe a guy who's not a quarterback, but definitely isn't getting as much attention as he should be. There's maybe other guys on the list from his position group that's on there who's not maybe performing as much as the other guy you have in mind. I have my guy in mind, but I'm just wondering who you think.
Yeah, I mean, Marvin Harrison was the other name that I think people are still banging on about. I'm actually not going to pick him to be perfectly honest. I don't think he's. I'm still not a believer of Ohio State. I know that sounds ridiculous, and we're about to find out this weekend whether I talk nonsense. But
Kyle McCord clearly is not a guy, in my opinion. So
yeah, so I don't believe in them, and I didn't believe in them at number 1. I found that an incredulous decision by the playoff committee. There's a few other names that are coming down the track, and please don't. I'm not picking him either. You know, you look at how Jalen Milroe has evolved this season. Now, if he takes Alabama, of course it'll be too late by that point. But if he takes Alabama into the college football playoff, which is a lot has to happen for that to go about. I've mentioned him already. I think Carson Beck has just gone about the way. I wasn't sure how Georgia's season was going to play out. There's no question the players and the talent they've got.
It's an embarrassment of riches almost at that school.
I thought, and I was at Nashville for SEC Media Days, and I was very fortunate to hear Kirby Smart talk about, it's not any team or anything that's really going to, it's complacency that's going to, trip us up. And I just felt as they went game on game on game, the pressure to do what they're doing would just build. Naturally, the pressure has to build, right? And in fact, and I asked them this last week, that's as far from the truth as it could be, because whenever you hear Kirby Smart or the players, they're just like this, they're shielded from the pressure. Carson Beck has just gone about his game, the games this season, in just an effortless way about it. He's no fuss, he's no frills, he doesn't run a lot with the ball, he's not going to catch people's eyes, therefore he's not going to get many Heisman votes. But actually, when you look at what he's done at the end of the season, particularly if he's picked up another national championship, then it's a bit of a shame. The other name I'm going to mention who has not had the season we hoped, I think it's a travesty that he hasn't won Heisman in the 3 years that he's been at Georgia, is Brock Bowers.
Oh, phenomenal tight end! Like he's going to be a first round pick.
He's going to be a top 10 pick, and I think I thought at the time it was a shame, scandal, whatever word you want to give. He didn't win it in his freshman year. That was an incredible season. Last year, he just lived up to that. Again, it was a great year, but everyone was like, well, he did that last year. This year, unfortunately, has been marred by the injury. But there's a player that should have won a Heisman. And then folk were, he's tight end, he's never going to win it. And he said that himself, the focus is never tight ends, but he's not really a tight end. I wanted to have an honorary mention for Brock Bowers, even though he's not even going to be close to the discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Milroe, because obviously I'm an LSU fan, so I'm a confirmed Alabama hater. But given the talk around him in the offseason, compared to what we've actually seen on the field this year, the difference is night and day. Now, I don't know if people just had everything wrong or he has actually made that leap in such short a time. But he's been absolutely fantastic. Same with Carson Beck, same with Brock Bowers. I think you know who I'm going to give as the dark horse, though. It's probably kind of a guy who's, for some reason, is being talked about below Marvin Harrison, despite the fact that he's had a much better year. And I'm going to have to go Malik Neighbors.
Yeah.
1,500 yards, 12 touchdowns. He's averaging almost 20 yards a play. He's a monster. He just is. He's not the biggest guy in the world either. He's only 6'2", 200, but to play the way he does, he's given a lot of people flashes of Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Now, he's not as good a prospect as Marvin Harrison. Do not get me wrong. I think Marvin Harrison's probably going to be way better in the NFL. But just at the college level, the fact that you see Marvin Harrison talked about, and there's a couple other receivers being talked about, but Malik Neighbors is kind of just a side show to this discussion is really shocking to me, because I think part of Jaden Daniels' success is having guys like Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Kieran Lacey, to a lesser extent, the Taylors. I just think as a receiver, he's probably the best in the country right now. And the fact that he's not being talked about, probably a bit of a surprise.
Yeah. I mean, he's built up a great relationship with Daniels. He's clearly the go-to guy. They play very well together. The thing is, it's hard for a wide receiver to get into the chat. And I know it happens, right? Devonta Smith won. But I think it's difficult. And with Marvin Harrison not having the season that I think people thought he was going to have, although the stats will probably prove that statement wrong, I just think it was difficult for somebody else to come up. It's a quarterback award, unfortunately, but in the same way as Brock Bowers, that some of these players find it really hard to break through, and of course it's even harder. Would you give it to Malik Neighbors over Jaden Daniels? Well, the answer to that is no, right? Because it's a quarterback who's going to get it, and that's where these guys are really going to suffer as a result, because he's never going to get into the conversation as such.
Yeah, especially because I've seen talk of Oregon and UW receivers on the list. If your quarterback's on the list, you're not getting in over them. And the fact of the matter is, if you have a receiver as good as guys like this, your quarterback's probably going to be in the discussion regardless. There's, even if he is not as good as the three guys we've just talked about, it's got to be in the discussion. But both Biletnikoff semifinalists, that's going to be huge. But finally, where do we see all three of these guys going in the draft? Because I've said it, I don't think Daniels is going to be a first-round pick, and that's just, size, weight concerns. But I think Penix Jr. and Bo Nix will be going very early in the draft. How do you see that going?
Well, you've picked the wrong person to ask about draft, because that's not my bag, and I profess not to try and get into that territory. And there's far many more people on the touchdown that are better at this than me, but I don't think so. Let me just start this. You've opened a can of worms, Kieran. You wish you'd never asked this question. I don't think any team should spend the first round pick on a quarterback. I've said that many times, right? I think there's much more value to be get from other positions. And so I think you let your quarterback slide. Of course, that never happened, right? I was at the 2018 draft where we had 6 quarterbacks went in the first round. Not so many of them are still playing in the NFL, but there you go, right? So I think you're right. I think this is a quarterback needy draft that's coming up. I think teams, as we've seen, really struggling. Again, I don't necessarily agree with it, because I think you bring your quarterback in and you let them settle for a year. But it's what have you done for me lately? So I think Penix almost certainly. I'm interested to see. I've just told you I don't talk about the draft, but I'm interested to see what happens to Caleb Williams after his season and some of the PR stuff that's come out.
I think the comparisons to Mahomes that he has drawn, fairly or unfairly, is actually going to hurt him in the long run, because people are expecting to see Patrick Mahomes, especially guys who don't necessarily college football, but they see the talking heads comparing him to Mahomes when really he just doesn't the only thing that reminds me of Mahomes is he's got a kind of weird throw-in motion. That's
Yeah,
the only thing. I think that's set him up for failure there.
I'm not buying it. I mean, I tell you now, I wouldn't spend a first pick or a first round pick on Caleb Williams. I wouldn't do it in any quarterback, as I've just said. I think Penix Jr. is probably the one of the three that I think is most likely to go in the first round. I'm not sure I would spend a first round pick on Bo Nix. You might get some value from him if he went down into the second or third round. But you know, that's just my view on life. But I think you get much more value from some of the other positions that you're going to get. But we know, you know, the Bears, the Giants, the usual suspects will be desperate to get a quarterback out of this draft.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll probably see Drake May as well in the
Yep.
mix of one of those guys. A guy who I've said I think is just safe. I don't think he's phenomenal, but I think he's got a really high floor. Whereas looking at Nix, Daniels, and Penix, it's definitely super high ceilings, but the floor could be in the basement, I think, for all three guys, given their athletic makeup. But yeah, anyway, thank you very much for joining me, George. This is the first time we've ever spoken. We got to talk quarterbacks, we got to talk college football, and most importantly, we got to have a little bit of a natter about the SEC, and that's what I love the most.
Awesome.
Before I let you plug all your stuff, like your Twitter and all that, I just want to let everyone know, make sure you like this video, subscribe, click the bell icon to make sure notifications on. We're going to have the NFL podcast with Lee, Taib, and Tom coming out in just a couple of days as well. They'll be recording, I think, tonight. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me, George. If you want to give, tell the people what you're doing.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And it was nice to meet you, Kieran. Yeah, well, I mean, most of my stuff comes out via the College Chat. So if you don't listen to the College Chat's podcast, then please do. I'm just about to bounce on to recording that one tonight. We've had some pretty awesome guests over the years, frankly, but this last couple of months have been pretty good. We had SC Commissioner Greg Sankey on, Andy Staples. We've had Laura Rutledge, who is a great supporter of our podcast, and I think that was her 6th or 7th time on the pod. So, yeah, please listen to that if you haven't. I write the Saturday in Athens column for the Touchdown, which is a roundup of all the news from the SEC, which I love to do because, as we know, it's the biggest and best conference in college football.
And I love to read it at work. It honestly gets me through the slower days, I'll be honest. But thank you very much, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.